I still remember the sound of the door slamming behind me, the echo that seemed to seal my fate. It was a crisp autumn evening when my family decided I no longer belonged among them. I was 22, stubborn and perhaps too outspoken for their taste. But nothing could have prepared me for that moment when my father, with cold eyes, told me to leave and never come back. My mother just sat there, silent, her gaze fixed on the floor. My siblings looked away, pretending to be fascinated by the painting on the wall. That painting, it always felt like it was watching me, mocking my existence. They had always loved appearances more than anything. Our family dinners were less about warmth and more about rehearsed lines and forced smiles. My father, a successful businessman, believed reputation was everything. Me. I was the crack in his perfect portrait, the rebel, the disappointment, the one who dared to question why our family secrets had to remain buried. That night, as I stepped out into the cold, I thought of all the times I tried to belong. The nights I lay awake, rehearsing words that might make them proud. But in the end it wasn't enough. I packed what little I had and left without looking back. I could still hear my father's voice in my mind, sharp and final. "You're no longer one of us." At first I tried to survive on my own, clinging to odd jobs and rented rooms that smelled of mold and regret. I found myself sleeping in places I never imagined. Train stations, a friend's couch, and once on a park bench under the indifferent gaze of passing strangers. Each night felt heavier than the last, and hope slowly faded into something darker, something like quiet resignation. Yet, in my solitude, I discovered a kind of freedom. Without their expectations crushing my spirit, I began to see life differently. I met people whose kindness had nothing to do with blood ties or wealth. A woman who offered me a cup of coffee on a freezing morning. A stranger who shared half his sandwich when he saw me hungry. Those small acts kept me alive more than food ever could. Years passed. My clothes changed, my scars faded, but the memory of that night never left me. I kept hearing that final sentence like a curse etched into my bones. "You're no longer one of us." And yet I wondered if they ever thought of me. If my absence was felt in that big house filled with empty laughter. I built a life outside their walls. It wasn't grand, but it was mine. I found work in a bookstore. Dusty shelves and the scent of old pages became my sanctuary. In books, I met souls who understood loneliness, who wrestled with pain and loss. And somewhere in those stories I began to heal. Then one rainy afternoon a letter arrived. My hands trembled as I opened it. The elegant handwriting was unmistakable. My father's lawyer. "You are requested to attend the reading of your father's will," it said. For a moment I couldn't breathe. My father, dead? And they wanted me there? The words blurred as tears filled my eyes. Not for him, but for the child I used to be. The child who had once believed a single kind word could change everything. But those words had never come. Now they were calling me back into the world that had broken me. I didn't know why, but deep inside I felt something had shifted. Something was waiting at that reading. Something they didn't expect. And as much as I feared facing them, a spark of curiosity began to burn. Maybe after all these years the truth was finally ready to step into the light. The days leading up to the reading of the will felt like stepping back into a life I'd buried long ago. Each hour crawled by, weighed down by questions I was too afraid to ask. Why no? Why include me after they had cast me aside? I tried to silence the hope whispering inside, telling myself not to expect anything. Yet late at night, lying awake in my small apartment, I couldn't help but imagine what waited for me. The day arrived, gray and heavy with rain. As I stood in front of the old family lawyer's office, my reflection in the rain-specked window startled me. I barely recognized the person staring back. Lines traced years of struggle on my face, but my eyes, they still held that quiet defiance, the spark that had survived every rejection. I stepped inside, my heart pounding in my chest like a warning. The receptionist guided me to a room that smelled faintly of dust and old secrets. And there they were, my family. My mother, dressed in black, her face a mask of sorrow that seemed more for show than grief. My brother, eyes cold and calculating, and my sister, whose perfect life had been built on the ruins of my exile. None of them looked at me. It was as if I were a ghost, a shadow they refused to acknowledge. The lawyer cleared his throat, breaking the silence that hung heavy like a funeral shroud. He was older now, his hair thinner, but his voice still carried the same calm authority I remembered from childhood. "Thank you all for coming," he began, his gaze lingering on me for a moment as if to say, You belong here whether they like it or not. As he started reading, my heart sank. The words were exactly what I had expected. My father's love and legacy bestowed upon my siblings. My brother received the family business, my sister the house and its contents. Each sentence felt like a fresh confirmation of what I had always known. I was never truly a part of them. Then the lawyer paused. He looked up, his eyes meeting mine. The room seemed to tighten around us, every breath caught in waiting. And to my eldest child, he read, I leave something different. The silence was sharp, cutting through the polite masks my family wore. My brother shifted in his seat, my sister's painted smile faltered, and even my mother's eyes flickered with something I couldn't name, fear perhaps or regret. The lawyer continued, his voice steady. To you I leave the truth I could never say in life. In the safe deposit box numbered 372, you will find letters explaining everything, why I made the choices I did and why I could never face you again. And along with them something that belongs to you alone. My breath caught in my throat. A safe deposit box? Letters? The lawyer handed me a small, worn envelope. My name, written in my father's unmistakable hand, stared back at me like a ghost from my past. My siblings exchanged quick, anxious glances. My brother's jaw tightened and my sister's eyes narrowed. The illusion they had built was cracking and they could feel it. I felt the weight of that envelope in my hand, a weight heavier than gold. For years I had wanted answers but never dared to hope they existed. Now they did. Whatever lay within those letters, it was meant for me alone. After the reading, my mother approached me. Her steps were hesitant, as though each one cost her something. For a moment she opened her mouth to speak, but no words came. Instead she turned away, the silence between us deeper than any apology could bridge. As I left the office, the rain greeted me like an old friend, washing away the dust of that room. I walked aimlessly, the envelope pressed against my chest, afraid to open it and afraid not to. My heart battled between hope and fear, between anger and longing. Finally, under the awning of a small cafe, I tore it open. Inside was a single key, cold and unremarkable but heavy with meaning. And a note written in my father's familiar script. I owed you the truth. Find it. And know that, despite everything, you were always my greatest regret, and my greatest love. The words blurred through my tears. For so long I had thought he hated me, that my existence was nothing but a stain on his pride. But in this single imperfect confession, I saw a man haunted by his own choices, a man as broken as the child he had rejected. And so, with shaking hands, I vowed to discover the truth my father had hidden. Not for him, not for them, but for the person I had become despite it all. The next morning I woke before dawn, the key lying beside me on the nightstand like a silent promise. Sleep had come only in brief, restless intervals, my mind a storm of questions and memories. I couldn't stop replaying my father's words. You were always my greatest regret, and my greatest love. They both comforted and haunted me. At sunrise I dressed and caught the earliest train downtown. The city seemed unfamiliar, even though its streets had been my refuge years ago. As the train rattled along, my reflection in the window stared back, older and wearier than I remembered, but carrying a determination I hadn't felt in years. This was no longer about revenge or closure. It was about truth. The truth my father had hidden and why. The bank was an imposing stone building, its facade etched with decades of history. I hesitated outside the revolving doors, my breath catching. What if the letters offered no answers? What if they revealed a truth darker than anything I imagined? But then I remembered the years I'd spent living with questions that gnawed at my soul. Anything was better than silence. Inside, the vault was cold and smelled faintly of oil and dust. The clerk, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, guided me to box 372. My hands trembled as I fitted the key into the lock. The mechanism clicked open, revealing a small stack of yellowed envelopes, bound together with twine, and a single sealed manila folder. For a long moment I just stared, my chest tight. These letters were written by a man who had died before I could ask him why. And yet here he was, reaching back through time to speak. I carried the contents to a small private room the bank provided. The light was dim and the silence heavy, broken only by the faint hum of the air conditioner. I sat, staring at the letters, afraid of what waited inside. Finally, I opened the first envelope. His handwriting was as familiar as my own, each letter carefully formed, as though he'd chosen every word with care. "If you are reading this," it began, "then my cowardice has outlived me. And perhaps in death I can be braver than I ever was in life." His words unraveled the past I thought I knew. He confessed to mistakes that weighed on him every day, the pressure to uphold the family name, the fear of scandal, and the guilt that had kept him awake at night. He wrote of a choice he had made when I was very young, something that changed everything but had remained buried for decades. My eyes blurred as I read, my hands cold. "You were never the disappointment I claimed you were," he wrote. "You were a threat, not to me but to the lie I built our family on. And for that I cast you out." I sat back, my mind spinning. What lie? What secret could be so terrible that he'd banish his own child to protect it? I opened the second letter. His words were shakier, the ink smudged in places as though he'd written through tears. He spoke of someone from his past, a woman he had loved before marrying my mother. A woman who had vanished suddenly, leaving behind a truth my father couldn't bear to face. "You were the child of that love," he confessed. "Not your mother's but hers." The word struck me like a blow. I wasn't my mother's child. My entire identity, every memory of her cold embrace, was built on a lie. The woman who had turned away from me at every opportunity had done so because I was living proof of betrayal. Shock gave way to something deeper, a strange, unexpected relief. Perhaps the coldness I had always felt from her wasn't because I was unworthy, but because I wasn't hers to love. It didn't erase the pain, but it explained it in a way that made cruel sense. The letters spoke of guilt, regret, and fear. My father had loved me, but his love was tangled in secrets that became chains. He ended his confession with a plea: "Forgive me if you can, though I know I have no right to ask. Find the folder. It holds what you deserve to know." Hands shaking, I reached for the manila folder. Inside were legal documents, birth certificates, and an old, faded photograph of a woman with kind eyes and a smile that felt strangely familiar. My mother. My real mother. She was beautiful. Not the cold beauty of the woman who raised me, but something softer, almost gentle. And there, scrawled on the back of the photo in my father's hand, were the words, "She loved you from the start." My breath caught. All these years I had believed myself unloved. But somewhere in another life there had been a mother who wanted me. I sat in that small room for what felt like hours, the weight of truth sinking into my bones. Outside, the world moved on, indifferent to the shattering of my carefully constructed reality. As I left the bank, the letters clutched to my chest. I knew I could never see my family the same way again. But more than that, I realized something even more powerful. For the first time, I knew who I truly was. Not the disappointment they had made me believe, but the child of a hidden love that had survived even the deepest betrayal. Walking out of the bank, the city felt different. Sharper, louder, almost alien. I moved through crowded streets like a ghost. The letters pressed against my chest as though they might vanish if I let go. The truth had landed in my hands, yet it felt too heavy to carry, too large to process all at once. That I wandered aimlessly, the hum of traffic and murmur of strangers blurring into background noise. My mind replayed my father's words over and over. "You were the child of that love." Those 7 words had demolished everything I thought I knew. The woman I had called mother, all my life, had never truly been mine. The coldness I'd felt wasn't imagined. It was rooted in something painfully real. A strange grief settled over me, not only for the life I had lost but for the love I had never received. And yet there was something else too, a quiet spark of belonging I hadn't dared to feel. Somewhere out there, there had been a woman who had loved me before the lie swallowed us both. By the time dusk turned the city golden and soft, I found myself standing in front of the old family home. The gate loomed before me, familiar yet forbidding. I hadn't been back here since the night they cast me out. My hand hesitated on the iron bars, memories flashing, birthday parties that ended in disappointment, family dinners where my laughter always felt out of place. I stepped back, unable to cross that invisible line. Whatever lay beyond belonged to the people who had built their lives on a lie. But my curiosity burned too fiercely to ignore. My father had written, "Find the folder. It holds what you deserve to know." I had found the folder, but what now? What was I supposed to do with the truth? As night settled, I returned to my small apartment, locking the door behind me as though to keep the past from following. The faded photograph lay on my kitchen table, her eyes meeting mine in silent recognition. I traced her face with my fingertip, wondering about her laugh, her voice, the stories she might have told me. Unable to sleep, I read my father's letters again and again, each word sinking deeper. Guilt tangled through his words, but also a tenderness I had never seen in life. "You were always my greatest love," he had written. Strange how those words hurt as much as they healed. Morning found me hollow-eyed but resolute. I needed to know more. Who was she? Where had she gone? And why had my father chosen silence over truth? I dug through the folder for clues. Old addresses, dates, fragments of correspondence my father had kept hidden all these years. One letter, dated shortly before my birth, caught my eye. It was from her, written in a looping hand that felt both unfamiliar and intimate. "If you decide to keep him, love him openly. Don't let your fear become his burden. He deserves more than secrets." My breath caught. Her words weren't just for him, they were for me too. She had fought for me even as fate tore us apart. I spent the next days buried in libraries and archives, following the faint trail she had left behind. Each discovery felt like unearthing a memory I never lived. A record of her working at a small bookstore, a brief mention in an old neighborhood newsletter. Piece by piece, a picture of her life began to emerge. Not the scandal my father had feared, but an ordinary woman who had loved quietly and fiercely. One evening, after hours of searching, I found her obituary. My hands trembled as I read. She had died when I was only 7, gone before I could even know her name. The grief I felt was strange, almost surreal for someone I had never truly met. Yet in that moment, the ache was real, raw, and undeniable. In the photo, her smile echoed in my reflection. A part of her had lived on in me, despite my father's silence. And for the first time in my life, I realized that not all love is erased by absence. The next day, driven by something I couldn't quite name, I returned to the lawyer's office. I needed to know why my father had left these letters now, after all these years. The lawyer, older and wearier than I remembered, studied me for a long moment before speaking. "He wanted to tell you while he was alive," he said quietly. "But in the end he feared what it would do to the family. So he chose this way. Too late perhaps, but it was all he had left to give." Too late. The words echoed painfully. But they were still mine, and I would make them mean something. That night I stood by my window, the city spread out below me. My family had chosen to bury the truth, but it had found its way to me anyway. And though it hurt, it also set me free. For the first time I wasn't who they said I was. I was something more. A child of hidden love, a survivor of silence. I closed my eyes and whispered into the darkness as though she might hear me. "I know now. And I won't let your love be forgotten." In the days that followed, I felt like I was living between two worlds. By day, I moved through the city, seeing familiar streets with unfamiliar eyes. By night, I read and reread the letters, each word opening wounds and offering comfort in equal measure. They became my compass, guiding me through memories I hadn't known were mine to claim. One morning, as dawn spilled pale light through my window, I caught sight of my reflection. For the first time, I noticed the ways my face resembled hers. The shape of the jaw, the curve of the brow, the quiet sadness in the eyes. It struck me that my resemblance wasn't to the woman who had raised me, but to the woman who had loved me from afar. The realization made my chest ache with something close to belonging. But questions still gnawed at me. Why had my father buried the truth so deeply? Why had he chosen to cast me out instead of protecting me? His letters spoke of love, but also of fear. Fear of losing everything he had built, of scandal, of my mother's wrath. It seemed so small to me now, choosing pride over a child. But I had lived long enough to know how fear can warp even the strongest hearts. I kept searching for traces of my real mother, driven by a need I couldn't quite name. In an old city archive, I found a record of her last known address. A modest apartment in a quiet neighborhood. That afternoon, I made my way there, my heart pounding with a hope that felt both foolish and necessary. The building stood unchanged by time, its brick facade worn and comforting in its ordinariness. I climbed the narrow staircase, each step creaking softly under my weight. At the door, I hesitated, my hand hovering over the faded number. She would never answer, I knew that, but somehow I felt closer to her just standing there. I knocked anyway, the sound echoing in the dim hallway. A moment later, an elderly woman opened the door. Her eyes softened when I explained who I was and why I had come. "She lived here," the woman said quietly. She was kind, kept to herself mostly, but always smiled. Left flowers on my doorstep once when my husband died. Her words painted a picture more vivid than any photograph. A gentle spirit who carried kindness even through heartbreak. My heart tightened as I imagined her life, waiting for news that would never come, carrying the weight of a love denied by someone else's fear. Before I left, the woman reached into a drawer and handed me something unexpected. A small tin box worn around the edges. She asked me to keep this just in case someone came looking one day, she said. My hands trembled as I accepted it, the weight of it somehow heavier than it should have been. Back in my apartment, I sat for a long time before opening it. Inside were a few small items. A dried flower brittle with age, a folded scrap of paper with my name written in her hand, and a delicate silver locket. My breath caught as I opened the locket to find two tiny photographs, one of her and one of me as a baby. Tears blurred my vision. All these years I had believed myself forgotten, unloved. Yet here was proof that she had carried me with her, even in absence. The dried flower, fragile and faded, felt more precious than gold. It spoke of love enduring beyond words, beyond time. Holding the locket, I whispered to the empty room, "I found you." And though silence answered, it felt softer, kinder, as though she were listening somewhere beyond the veil. That night, I placed the locket by my bedside, the letters beside it. My father's words, my mother's keepsake. They were all pieces of a puzzle I had finally begun to assemble. The picture it formed wasn't perfect, but it was real. And for the first time, real was enough. Yet one question remained. What would I do now? The truth had set me free, but it had also left me standing at a crossroads. Should I confront the family who had raised me on lies? Should I walk away forever, carrying my truth quietly into a life of my own making? Sleep offered no answers, only dreams filled with faces. Hers, my father's, even my siblings. I woke with the dawn, my heart heavy but resolute. Whatever lay ahead, I knew this. I could not let the truth die in silence as it had nearly died with my father. The past had shaped me, but it would no longer define me. And so, with trembling hands but a steady heart, I began to write my own letter. A letter to them. Not to destroy but to reveal. Not to punish but to set free. The words came slowly at first, hesitant, like a wound reopening. But as I wrote, the dam inside me broke. My hand moved across the page, spilling years of silence into sentences that felt both foreign and deeply mine. "I know the truth now," I began. "I know why I never belonged, why the coldness in your eyes felt like something more than disappointment." I wrote of the letters, of my real mother's name, of the quiet kindness she had left behind in a tin box. Every sentence felt like laying down a stone I had carried for too long. I didn't write to accuse them, though anger burned quietly beneath my words. I wrote because the truth demanded light. Because secrets had broken enough hearts already. Mine, my father's, hers. And because somewhere, buried beneath years of lies, there had to be something human left in them, something that could still recognize pain. By the time I finished, my hand ached, and the morning sun had climbed high in the sky. I folded the letter carefully, sealing it in an envelope with shaking fingers. It felt like offering my heart on paper, raw and unguarded. Walking to the family house felt surreal, as though each step was pulling me deeper into a story I wasn't sure I wanted to finish. The gate stood open as though waiting. The house, grand yet cold, loomed before me, so familiar yet impossibly distant. I knocked on the heavy wooden door, the sound echoing through marble halls that had once felt like a prison. It was my brother who answered, his expression unreadable. For a heartbeat, neither of us spoke, the air thick with memories we both wished we could erase. "I need to see all of you," I said, my voice steady despite the tremor I felt inside. He hesitated, then stepped aside, wordlessly guiding me to the sitting room where my mother and sister waited. They looked almost surprised to see me standing there, as though the will reading had been a brief disturbance they expected would fade. But I didn't fade. I stood before them, the letter in my hand, and for the first time in years I spoke without fear. "I know the truth," I said quietly. "About her. About why I was cast out." My mother flinched, her mask cracking for an instant. My sister's eyes widened and my brother's jaw tightened. The silence that followed felt endless, broken only by the ticking of the old clock on the mantel. "I didn't come to hurt you," I continued. "But I won't let the truth die with him. You don't have to speak. Just listen." Their eyes stayed fixed on me, wary, but none of them interrupted. I opened the letter and began to read aloud. My voice trembled at first but grew stronger as the words poured out, words I had waited a lifetime to say. When I spoke of my real mother, my voice caught. I described the woman in the photograph, the locket, the dried flower. I watched something shift in my mother's eyes, a flicker of pain perhaps or shame. For a moment she seemed smaller, human. I finished, my chest tight, the room heavy with the weight of what could no longer be denied. Silence settled around us, oppressive yet somehow cleansing. My brother was the first to speak, his voice low and strained. "Why bring this here now?" "Because hiding it broke us all," I replied. "And because I won't let her memory be buried in your silence." My sister's eyes glistened, though she said nothing. My mother looked away, her shoulders sinking as though under an invisible burden. She whispered something so soft I barely heard it. "We thought it was best." Best for whom? The question burned on my tongue, but I let it go. I had come not for answers but for truth, and the truth now lay between us, undeniable. Without another word, I placed the letters and the locket on the table. "These belong to the past," I said. "But the past belongs to me too." As I turned to leave, I felt lighter, as though the chains I had carried so long had finally fallen away. I didn't know what would come next, whether they would hate me more or finally see me. But it no longer mattered. Outside, the sun broke through clouds, warm on my face. For the first time, I felt a quiet certainty. I had spoken my truth, and whatever lay ahead, I would walk toward it as myself. No longer the outcast child, but the keeper of a story that was mine to tell. And as I stepped away from the house that had once exiled me, I realized something simple yet profound. Freedom isn't always a place. It's the moment you stop living someone else's lie. I walked for what felt like hours after leaving the house, my steps aimless but my mind painfully alive. The city moved around me, people rushing past, horns blaring, conversations floating on the breeze, but I felt oddly apart from it all. As though, in speaking my truth, I had stepped into a new life still half-formed. In my pocket I still carried one last letter from my father. Unopened, its seal unbroken. It had been tucked between the others, marked simply, "For when you're ready." At first I hadn't dared to read it, afraid of what it might reveal. But now, standing on a quiet bridge overlooking the slow, steady river, I realized that ready was never a moment you reached. It was a choice you made. I opened it with trembling fingers. His handwriting felt different here. Less careful, almost hurried, as if written in a rush of confession. By the time you read this, I hope you have found the letters and the truth they hold. But there is one thing left to say, something I could never bring myself to speak aloud. I loved her. And I loved you. More than I ever let myself show. I paused, the words blurring through tears I hadn't realized were falling. I watched you grow, saw so much of her in you. It frightened me because every time I looked at you, I remembered the man I had been, and the man I failed to become. My silence was cowardice, and I see that now. If there is redemption after death, let it be in these words. You were never unwanted. You were always my heart's true heir. My breath caught. True heir. The phrase echoed in my mind, strange and powerful. For years I had believed myself discarded, forgotten. Yet here, in his final words, lay an inheritance greater than any fortune. A reluctant but undeniable claim. If you wish to know more, there is a second folder. One your siblings do not know exist. Ask the lawyer. It holds what I could not say and what you deserve to see. The letter ended simply, "Forgive me if you can, but live even if you can't. Your father." I folded the paper slowly, my hands shaking not from cold, but from something deeper. A release, maybe, or the weight of understanding finally settling in. As dusk painted the water in shades of gold and violet, I felt a strange peace. His love hadn't erased the pain he'd caused, but it softened the edges of it. And in that moment I realized forgiveness isn't a gift you give the dead. It's something you give yourself so you can keep breathing. The next morning I went back to the lawyer's office. The air felt thicker this time, as though the walls themselves remembered the last time I'd been there. The lawyer greeted me with a solemn nod, as though he had been expecting this visit. "There is another folder," I said quietly. "My father mentioned it." He hesitated, studying me with careful eyes. Then, without a word, he unlocked a drawer and placed a thin, dark blue folder on the table. "He asked me to give this to you and you alone," he said. My pulse quickened as I reached for it. Inside I found documents, letters, and a single photograph. My father, younger than I had ever known him, standing beside my real mother. Their smiles were soft, private, captured in a moment that spoke of a love no secret could truly erase. Among the papers was something unexpected. A legal document, signed and dated, naming me as the beneficiary of a separate account, one my siblings knew nothing about. It wasn't a fortune, but it was enough to mean something. Enough to prove that, in the end, he had tried to make amends in the only way he knew how. But beyond money, the real inheritance lay in a letter folded neatly within the folder. In it, my father wrote not as the man bound by duty and fear, but as someone stripped bare of pretense. If I could live again, I would have chosen honesty over pride. I see now that love hidden is love wasted. You are my redemption if redemption is possible. Use what I leave you not to remember me, but to build the life I denied you. Reading those words, I felt something inside me shift. A weight lifting, if only slightly. For so long I had defined myself by their rejection. But standing there, the afternoon sun streaming through dust-speckled glass, I realized I was more than what they had chosen to see. I thanked the lawyer, his eyes kind, though shaded by years of keeping other people's secrets. Stepping outside, the city felt different again, not softer exactly but clearer. The truth was painful, but it had given me something no lie ever could. A beginning. And so, clutching the folder to my chest, I turned toward tomorrow, not as the child cast out, but as the heir of two flawed human hearts who had, in their own broken ways, loved me all along. For days after I left the lawyer's office, I carried the folder everywhere, tucked under my arm on crowded buses, resting beside me on park benches where I sat watching strangers move through lives untouched by my family's secrets. It became something like an anchor, a reminder that my past was real, no matter how deeply it had been buried. At night, I'd spread the papers across my small kitchen table, tracing the faded ink of my father's words, the careful signatures, and the fragile photograph of my real parents. Each detail felt like a thread, weaving me back into a story I had been forced out of before I even understood I belonged to it. And yet, despite everything I had learned, questions still clung to me like shadows. Why had my father chosen secrecy over love? Why had my siblings been raised in comfort while I was left to wander in exile? Part of me knew the answers lay in fear. Of scandal, of losing everything built on the illusion of a perfect family. But another part of me wanted to hear it from them, to look into their eyes and see the truth reflected there. The thought of confronting them again felt heavy. But the longer I waited, the more I realized this wasn't about them at all. It was about me. About reclaiming the voice they had tried to silence. And so, with trembling hands and a heart that felt both fragile and unbreakable, I wrote another letter, this time addressed to my siblings. In it, I told them what I had discovered, not to accuse but to reveal. I described my real mother, the love my father had confessed, and the quiet strength it had taken me to uncover a past they had been protected from all along. As I walked to deliver it, memories flooded back. Birthdays where my brother's laughter echoed while I watched from the edges, holidays where my sister's smile drew warmth from everyone but me. Those memories stung, but the pain felt duller now, tempered by the knowledge that I had never truly been theirs to love, or to hate. I left the letters with the doorman of the family home, my heart pounding as I turned away. The weight of expectation lifted the moment the envelopes left my hand. For the first time in years, I realized I wasn't waiting for their approval or even their understanding. The truth wasn't a weapon to hurt them, it was a torch to light my own way forward. That evening, I returned to the apartment and sat in silence, the city lights flickering against the window pane. I thought about my father, not as the man whose silence had broken me, but as someone who had tried too late to make amends. His letters had not erased the scars he left, but they had offered me something deeper than apology. The choice to forgive. Forgiveness, I discovered, wasn't about erasing pain or pretending it had never existed. It was about refusing to let it define what came next. In the days that followed, there was no response from my family. At first, the silence felt like a familiar wound reopening. But slowly I began to see it differently, not as rejection but as confirmation that my story no longer needed their permission to be true. One morning, standing by the window as dawn painted the sky in pale gold, I made a decision that felt as final as it was freeing. I would leave this city. Not to run away, but to begin somewhere new, where my name wasn't a shadow of secrets, and my reflection wasn't bound to their lies. With what my father had left me, I could afford to start over. It wasn't wealth, but it was enough. a quiet inheritance that spoke more of regret than of fortune, but one that carried hope all the same. I packed my few belongings into boxes, each object a piece of the life I had built in exile. The chipped coffee mug from the bookstore where I had worked, the second-hand books whose pages had kept me company on sleepless nights, and most precious of all, the locket holding the photograph of a woman who had loved me silently from afar. As I sealed the last box, I paused, my hand resting on it, and whispered a promise: I won't let your love be lost. It felt like speaking to both of them, my real mother whose face I carried and my father whose guilt had finally set the truth free. Outside, the street seemed unchanged, yet everything felt different. I no longer saw the cracks in the pavement as reminders of where I had stumbled, but as proof of where I had kept walking. And so, as dawn broke fully into day, I stepped out of the apartment for the last time, not as the disinherited child, not as the exile, but as someone finally ready to claim the life that had always been waiting beyond the silence. The morning I left the city felt strangely gentle. The summer air was soft on my face as I stepped into the street, my suitcase rolling behind me like a quiet witness to everything I had endured. I paused at the corner, glancing back at the apartment building where so many nights had been spent searching old letters for answers, speaking silently to ghosts who could never reply. I expected to feel fear as I walked away, but what I felt instead was an unfamiliar calm. The life I was leaving behind had never truly been mine. It had been a waiting room, a place where I had measured time by grief and questions. And now, at last, it felt right to step beyond it. On the train out of the city, I watched the skyline recede into the haze of morning. The windows caught my reflection, and for the first time I didn't look away. The scars, inside and out, were still there, but they no longer felt like proof of my failures. Instead, they felt like evidence of survival, of a quiet refusal to disappear. The town I chose was far enough that no one would know my name, but close enough that it didn't feel like exile. A place of narrow streets and old brick buildings, where strangers offered small, polite nods that asked for nothing in return. I rented a small flat above a used bookshop, its windows dusty and full of sun-faded covers that whispered stories older than memory. My first night there, I unpacked slowly, laying each object carefully in its place. The locket went on the nightstand, catching the last light of the day. My father's letters rested in a drawer, still unread again since that final morning. Not because they no longer mattered, but because I had finally accepted that their truths lived inside me now, not just on the page. For the first few days, I drifted through the town quietly. I found a cafe on the corner where the owner learned my order without asking, a library that smelled of dust and forgotten hopes, a small park where children's laughter felt like a promise that life could be gentle too. Slowly a routine took shape. Mornings with coffee and silent reflection, afternoons wandering among shelves of old books, evenings walking under street lamps that hummed softly in the quiet. Each step felt like planting a flag in this new life, even if no one else could see it. But it wasn't all ease. Some nights I'd wake in darkness, my chest tight with memories I hadn't chosen. The face of the woman who raised me, always cold and distant. The echo of my father's voice, heavy with words never spoken. And the ache of knowing my real mother had loved me in silence, yet I had lived most of my life without her touch. On those nights, I'd reach for the locket, holding it until the trembling eased. It became a ritual, a reminder that love doesn't always vanish just because it was hidden. And each time I found the strength to sleep again. As days turned to weeks, the town began to feel less like a hiding place and more like a beginning. In the bookstore downstairs, I started helping the owner, an older woman named Ellen whose kindness was quiet and steady. She never asked about my past, but once, when she caught me staring too long at the family photographs on the counter, she placed a hand gently on my arm and simply said, "You belong here too." It was a small kindness, but it echoed louder than she could know. One evening as I closed the shop, I caught sight of my reflection in the darkened glass. I expected to see the exile, the forgotten child. But what I saw surprised me. A quiet strength shaped by loss but not defined by it. My father's regret, my mother's hidden love, my own pain, they were still there, but they had become part of me, not all of me. And in that reflection I whispered a promise, not to them but to myself. This is your life now. Live it. It didn't mean the past no longer hurt or that the scars had vanished. But it meant I could carry them forward without letting them weigh me down. And for the first time the road ahead felt open. Not easy, not certain, but mine. As the last light faded, I locked the shop door, turned the key in my pocket and stepped into the evening. The town was quiet, the street lamps flickering gently. And with each step I felt it more clearly. I had not escaped my past. I had chosen to walk beside it and still keep moving. Days turned into weeks, and with each passing moment the new life I was building felt more real, more mine. The town's quiet rhythm soothed the chaos that had once roared inside me. I still carried the weight of my past, but it no longer consumed me. Instead, it became the foundation upon which I could stand. I started journaling again, something I hadn't done in years. Writing helped me sift through the tangle of emotions. The anger, the sorrow, the tentative hope. My pen traced memories I'd tried to forget and new dreams I dared to imagine. Sometimes the words came slowly, fragmented, but eventually they formed a story only I could tell. One morning, while sipping coffee at the little cafe on Main Street, a stranger sat beside me. She was older, with silver streaks in her dark hair and eyes that seemed to hold 1,000 stories. She introduced herself as Marissa, a writer working on a book about people who had been cast aside and found their way back. Our conversation was tentative at first, but soon she asked me to share my story. For hours I told her about my childhood. The rejection, the exile, the letters from my father, and the discovery of my real mother. I didn't hold back the pain or the confusion. She listened, nodding gently, her eyes reflecting understanding rather than judgment. When I finished, she smiled and said, "Your story isn't just about loss. It's about resilience. About how we carry the past with us but still find a way to move forward." Her words stayed with me long after we parted. Maybe it was time to tell my story. Not just to strangers but to the world. Not for revenge or to expose my family, but to reclaim the narrative that had been stolen from me. That evening I pulled out the folder of letters once more. My father's words, my mother's keepsakes. They weren't just relics of pain but symbols of survival. I realized that by sharing my story I could transform the silence into strength. As I began drafting the first chapter of my own memoir, I felt a sense of purpose awakening inside me. This was no longer about what I had lost but what I had found. The courage to face the past and the power to shape my future. The journey was far from over. There would be days when the memories would weigh heavy, when doubt crept in and the scars throbbed anew. But I was no longer alone in the darkness. I had my story, my truth, and the quiet but unbreakable promise I made to myself. To live authentically despite everything. And as the night deepened outside my window, I wrote the words that had eluded me for so long. I am more than their rejection. I am the love they hid, the truth they feared, and the hope I carry forward. The days grew shorter as autumn crept in, painting the streets with amber and crimson hues. The changing season matched the transformation stirring inside me, a quiet reckoning with the person I was becoming. Writing my story wasn't just an act of catharsis. It was a declaration of existence. A reclaiming of identity that had been denied for so long. Marissa and I met regularly at the cafe, her encouragement steady as the coffee we shared. Sometimes she pushed me to dig deeper, to confront the darkest parts of my past I'd long avoided. Other times she simply listened, letting the silence between our words hold space for healing. One afternoon, as the sun filtered through stained glass windows casting colored patterns on the table, Marissa asked, "Have you thought about sharing your story beyond these pages? Maybe a public reading or an online blog?" The idea terrified me. Exposure had always meant vulnerability, and vulnerability had been met with rejection before. Yet beneath the fear there was a flicker of hope, a possibility that my voice could reach others who felt lost in their own silence. After much deliberation, I decided to start small. I created a blog, anonymously at first, where I posted excerpts from my writing. The response was unexpected. Messages began to trickle in from strangers who saw pieces of themselves in my story. Those cast aside by family, betrayed by love, searching for belonging. Each message was a reminder that my pain wasn't unique, but part of a larger tapestry of human experience. My voice, once silenced by fear and shame, now resonated in the quiet corners of the internet, offering solace and connection. Buoyed by this, I arranged my first public reading at the local library. The night was cool, and the room was filled with a small but attentive crowd, faces lit by the soft glow of candlelight, their eyes reflecting empathy and curiosity. As I read aloud the words that had once been locked inside me, I felt a power I hadn't known before. My story, once a source of isolation, became a bridge, connecting me to others through shared vulnerability and courage. After the reading, a woman approached me, tears glistening in her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. "Your story gave me hope to face my own." In that moment, I understood something profound. Our stories are not just about the past, they are tools to shape the future. Not only for ourselves but for those who come after. Returning home that night, I felt a deep sense of peace. The road ahead would still hold challenges. Old wounds sometimes reopened, doubts that crept in, but I was no longer alone. I had found my voice, my community, and a purpose that transcended the pain of my past. As I closed my journal and prepared for sleep, I whispered a promise to myself: to keep telling my story, to keep seeking truth, and to never let silence define me again. The following weeks unfolded with a strange mixture of exhaustion and exhilaration. Sharing my story publicly was more draining than I had anticipated, but also profoundly healing. Each time I spoke, wrote, or listened to someone else's experience, I felt the invisible chains of my past loosen just a little more. My blog grew steadily, drawing readers from places I'd never imagined. Messages poured in, some thanking me for the courage to speak, others sharing their own painful histories. The community that emerged felt like a fragile but vital lifeline, binding strangers through shared scars and whispered truths. One evening, after replying to a message from a young woman struggling with her own family's rejection, I received an unexpected invitation. A small publishing house had come across my blog and wanted to talk about turning my story into a book. The news left me stunned, excited, terrified, and overwhelmed all at once. I thought back to the nights when I sat alone, poring over my father's letters and my mother's keepsakes, wondering if anyone would ever care about my story. Now that distant hope was knocking at my door, demanding I face a new kind of vulnerability. The first meeting with the publisher was both thrilling and nerve-wracking. Sitting across from a warm-faced editor who listened with genuine interest, I realized how much I'd grown. The girl who once hid in shadows was becoming a woman ready to own her narrative. We discussed the book's structure, how to weave the rawness of my past with the hope I had found. I wanted it to be honest, unflinching, but also a testament to resilience. A story that could reach others caught in silence, offering a flicker of light in their darkest hours. As the deal was finalized, a new chapter in my life began. Not just the telling of my story, but the reclaiming of my identity on my own terms. I worked closely with the editor, revising and refining, sometimes reliving the pain but always moving forward. Throughout this process, the relationships I'd built grew deeper. Marissa remained a steady presence, her faith in me unwavering. Ellen from the bookstore became a confidant and cheerleader, reminding me that kindness often comes from unexpected places. And then came the day I received an email that shook me, a message from my siblings. They'd read the blog, heard about the book, and wanted to meet. The past, it seemed, was no longer a wall but a bridge waiting to be crossed. The thought of facing them again stirred a tempest of emotions. Fear, anger, curiosity, and an unexpected flicker of hope. Would they acknowledge the truth now? Would they accept me? Or would the wounds of years past prove too deep? After much soul-searching, I agreed to meet. The day was gray and overcast as I entered the cafe where we'd arranged to see each other. Their faces were a mixture of apprehension and tentative warmth. The conversation was difficult, full of long silences and careful words, but it was a start. For the first time, we spoke openly about the past, the lies, and the pain. I shared my journey, my discoveries, and the truths that had set me free. Slowly, the walls they'd built began to crack. I saw glimpses of remorse in my mother's eyes and a guarded vulnerability in my brother's. My sister, quiet but present, reached out and held my hand. It wasn't a fairy tale reconciliation. It was messy, real, and fragile. But it was something I hadn't dared hope for. A chance to rewrite the story of my family, not as one of rejection, but of tentative healing. Leaving the cafe that day, I felt lighter, as though a chapter had closed and another was beginning. The past would always be part of me, but it no longer had to define my future. And as I walked away, I whispered to myself, this is the life I choose, broken, beautiful, and mine. The days following that meeting with my siblings felt surreal, like waking from a long, restless dream into a fragile new reality. I wasn't sure what to expect next: forgiveness? Rejection? Something in between? The silence after our conversation was heavy, pregnant with possibility and doubt. I tried to focus on my writing, on the book that was beginning to take shape. Pouring my story onto paper felt like both a lifeline and a reckoning, an act of courage and vulnerability intertwined. But every time I sat down to write, memories threatened to overwhelm me, the wounds still raw beneath the words. One afternoon, while working in the bookstore, Ellen surprised me with an invitation. She wanted me to participate in a local storytelling event, to share my journey with a wider audience. The thought terrified me, but there was also a spark of excitement. Could I stand in front of strangers and bare my soul? Could I transform pain into power? After days of hesitation, I agreed. The night of the event, the community center was filled with curious faces, some familiar, others strangers drawn by the promise of raw, honest stories. When my turn came, I stepped onto the small stage, heart pounding, palms sweaty. I began to speak, my voice shaky but growing steadier with each word. I told them about the family that disowned me, the hidden letters, the discovery of a mother's love I never knew I had. I spoke of rejection and resilience, of pain and the fragile hope that kept me moving forward. As I shared, something shifted. The room seemed to lean in, breaths held in shared understanding. Tears welled in more than one eye, including my own. When I finished, the silence was broken by applause, soft at first, then growing louder. That night, after the event, a woman approached me. Her name was Rachel, and she shared her own story of loss and estrangement. We talked late into the night, finding comfort in shared experience and the strange healing power of connection. Our friendship blossomed quickly, a balm to the loneliness that had shadowed much of my life. Rachel's courage inspired me, and I found myself opening up in ways I hadn't dared before. For the first time in a long time, I felt truly seen, not as the child cast aside but as a whole, complex person. With her support, I began to envision new possibilities. Maybe one day I could return to the city where my family lived, not as the rejected daughter, but as the woman who had survived, grown, and reclaimed her story. But that future still felt distant, a fragile hope held close to my chest like a precious secret. For now, I focused on the present, on healing, on writing, on building a life where my past didn't define me. One evening, sitting by the window as autumn leaves fell softly outside, I realized how far I'd come. The journey had been painful, marked by loss and loneliness, but also by unexpected love and fierce determination. I smiled softly, clutching the locket that had started it all, a symbol of love hidden but never lost. And I whispered a promise to myself and to the mother I'd never truly known. Your love found me, and I will carry it with me always. The quiet moments in my new life were where the deepest transformations happened, the spaces between the noise where I could breathe, reflect, and simply be. I had learned that healing wasn't a straight path. It twisted and turned, looping back on itself in ways I couldn't always predict. Some days felt like progress, others like steps back into the shadows I thought I'd left behind. But through it all, I held on to the small, steady truths I had discovered. That I was more than the sum of my pain, more than the rejection and silence that had once defined me. I was a survivor, a storyteller, a woman reclaiming her voice piece by piece. One chilly morning, I woke to a message that stirred a mix of hope and hesitation. An invitation from a distant cousin I'd never met, someone who had heard about my story through the blog and wanted to connect. Her name was Lila, and she wrote with warmth and curiosity, offering a glimpse into a branch of my family tree I'd only just begun to explore. The idea of meeting someone new from my bloodline, someone untainted by the old wounds and betrayals, felt like a fragile thread of possibility. I answered her letter cautiously, unsure if this connection would bring comfort or complicate the tangled web of my past. We began exchanging letters regularly, each one peeling back layers of family history and shared experience. Lila's stories were full of laughter and loss, resilience and dreams. She spoke of ancestors who had crossed oceans, built lives from nothing, and passed down secrets wrapped in love and survival. Through her words, I felt the weight of loneliness lift slightly. I was not as alone as I'd believed. There were branches of my family reaching out, waiting to be found. And in that discovery, I found a quiet joy, a sense that my story was part of something larger, a continuing legacy I could choose to embrace or redefine. Encouraged by Lila's support, I decided to visit her. The journey was more emotional than I expected. As the train carried me through rolling hills and sun-dappled fields, memories of rejection and exile mingled with a growing anticipation. What would it mean to meet family who knew nothing of the pain I carried? Would they see me as I was now or only through the prism of my past? When I arrived, Lila greeted me with open arms and a warmth that felt like sunlight breaking through years of cloud. Her home was filled with books, photographs, and the smell of fresh bread, a haven of stories and love. Our days together unfolded slowly, filled with laughter, shared meals, and quiet conversations that stretched late into the night. She introduced me to cousins and friends, weaving me into a community I hadn't known existed. For the first time, I experienced the simple joy of belonging, not the complicated, conditional belonging of my childhood, but a pure, unearned acceptance. It was both exhilarating and humbling. In Lila's family, I found echoes of myself. The same stubborn streak, the same hunger for truth and connection. We shared stories of pain and hope, of mistakes made and lessons learned. And in those exchanges, I felt a healing I hadn't anticipated, as if the cracks in my heart were slowly being filled with light. But even in this newfound sanctuary, the past wasn't far behind. Old fears and doubts whispered in the quiet moments, reminding me of scars that would take time to fade. I knew that healing was ongoing, a journey without a fixed destination. As I prepared to return home, Lila pressed a small worn book into my hands, a family journal passed down through generations. "For you," she said softly, "so you can carry our story with you and add your own chapter." Holding the journal, I felt a deep sense of gratitude and responsibility. My story was no longer just my own. It was part of a larger tapestry woven through time, full of pain and beauty, loss and love. On the train ride back, I opened the journal and began to read. Each page whispered of resilience and hope, of people who had faced impossible odds and chosen to keep going. Their courage bolstered my own. Back in my quiet flat, I placed the journal beside my own writing, feeling a profound connection to those who had come before me and those who would come after. I realized that my story, with all its twists and wounds, was a vital thread in the fabric of my family's history. That night, I wrote a new passage in my memoir, reflecting on the journey that had brought me here. The words flowed freely, filled with gratitude for the pain that had shaped me and the love that had saved me. I am not defined by abandonment or silence, but by the courage to seek truth and the strength to embrace it. My story is a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, a beacon for those still lost in the shadows, and a promise that even broken hearts can be made whole. As I closed my notebook, I felt a quiet peace settle within me. The road ahead was still uncertain, but I no longer feared it. I carried with me the love of those who had come before, the support of new family found, and the unshakable belief that my life, in all its imperfection, was enough. The momentum I'd gained from reconnecting with Lila and her family carried me into a new phase of my life, one marked by cautious optimism and the slow rebuilding of trust. I was learning to live with the paradox of holding on to the past while stepping boldly into the future. The book project continued to progress, and with Marissa's help, I refined my memoir until it felt authentic, raw, and ready to share. But as the publication date neared, a new challenge emerged, facing the public eye. The idea of strangers reading my story, the intimate, painful details I had wrestled with in private, both terrified and empowered me. I knew that exposure meant vulnerability, but also the chance to touch lives beyond my immediate circle. To prepare, I started giving interviews and participating in podcasts, sometimes masking my nerves with practiced calm. Each appearance was a test, a reminder that my voice had power even when it trembled. One day during a radio interview, the host asked me about forgiveness, a topic I had wrestled with deeply. I took a breath and answered honestly. "Forgiveness isn't about forgetting or excusing the past," I said. "It's about freeing yourself from the chains of anger and pain. It's about reclaiming your peace." The interview sparked an outpouring of responses, messages from people who shared their own struggles with family, loss, and forgiveness. The conversations deepened my understanding that my story was not just personal but universal. Meanwhile, my relationship with my siblings continued to evolve. We had tentative moments of connection as well as setbacks that reminded me healing was never linear. But the door was open, and that was enough. One afternoon, my brother called unexpectedly. His voice was hesitant, but there was warmth I hadn't heard in years. "Can we meet?" he asked. We agreed to meet at a small cafe. Sitting across from him, I saw a man shaped by his own regrets and hopes. Our conversation was careful, at times awkward, but beneath it lay a desire to rebuild what had been broken. We talked about our shared history, the pain we'd each endured, and the possibility of a future where family wasn't defined by perfection, but by effort and understanding. That evening I reflected on how far I'd come. From the child disowned and silenced, to a woman whose voice now reached strangers across the world. The journey had been painful and beautiful in equal measure. I understood now that family wasn't always about blood or proximity, but about the willingness to forgive. The launch of my book was a milestone that brought a mix of nerves, pride, and the hope that my story might touch anyone who had ever felt invisible or unloved. That night, surrounded by friends, strangers, and newly formed bonds, I realized my story was not one of defeat but of resilience. In that moment, I felt I had truly reclaimed my place in the world, not as the forgotten child, but as a woman who had found her voice. Publishing the book brought a sense of both familiarity and newness. The routine of writing remained, but messages from readers sharing their pain and hope showed me my words had an impact beyond the pages. Yet this new visibility reopened old wounds. Difficult questions surfaced. Was I ready for judgment? How would my family react? Who was I now? One ordinary day I found a letter from my mother. In shaky handwriting she spoke of regret, hidden love, and her desire to see me again. Reading her words stirred pain and longing, but I chose to reply. My letter was honest yet hopeful for healing. When she came to visit there was awkwardness but also warmth. Slowly we built a fragile bond based on sincerity and cautious steps. I began to see her not only as the absent mother but as a woman marked by fear and silent love. This reconciliation taught me that family is imperfect, full of shadows and light. Over time, our relationship became an unexpected source of strength. Embracing my past fully allowed me to move forward more whole. Writing remained a refuge, helping me process and inspire. My voice no longer belonged only to me. It also belonged to those who needed to hear that there is hope even in darkness. One day, my mother's friend Claire reached out. She shared stories I'd never heard, of my mother's struggles against judgment and her lonely fight to protect me through silence. Claire also sent me a journal my mother had kept during the years we were apart. Reading it revealed her humanity and complexity. I began writing back as if in conversation with her across time. I shared the journal with Rachel and Marissa, who supported me and reminded me healing is a slow but necessary journey. My book took on new depth. It was no longer just about abandonment but also about understanding, forgiveness, and imperfect love. Slowly, I stopped seeing myself as a victim and started recognizing the strength it took to face my pain. Reading my father's letters raised more questions. Why so many secrets? I came to see him as flawed and human, shaped by fear and hope. Visiting his grave on a chilly autumn day, I spoke aloud my hurt, my gratitude, and my wish for peace. Leaving, I felt lighter, ready to finish my memoir with a broader understanding. When the book was finally released, I felt proud of the path I'd walked, from rejection to reclaiming my voice. Holding my locket, a symbol of hidden love, I promised myself to live without fear. Messages from readers began arriving, people who saw their own stories in mine. The vulnerability I had feared turned out to be strength, a bridge, not a barrier. At events, I saw in people's eyes the power of shared pain and healing. My relationships with my mother and sister grew slowly. My sister suggested another meeting, more open this time. We talked about childhood, about the love we'd both missed, about wounds we shared. We cried but also laughed, and I began to see her not as a rival but as someone else trying to heal. With my mother, letters turned into phone calls, then visits. It was never easy, but each step was built on honesty. I realized family isn't just blood but the willingness to keep trying. One evening, after a reading, a young woman thanked me with tears in her eyes, saying my story had given her courage to reconnect with her family. That moment made me see. My pain and healing weren't just mine, they were part of a larger human journey. I knew setbacks would come. Healing isn't linear. With autumn deepening, I reflected that family isn't perfect. It's messy, complicated, but can hold tremendous love. Then came a decisive moment. Meeting my family again, not to erase the past but to face it together. We sat in a sunlit room, carrying our scars and hopes. I spoke first, sharing my journey, the pain and strength it took to get there. There were tears, apologies, and respectful silences. My mother reached out with a trembling hand, and for the first time, we connected not as broken strangers but as a healing family. My siblings shared regrets and slowly we began to rebuild. It wasn't a perfect reconciliation, but it was a start. A choice to mend rather than remain divided. Leaving the room, I felt the past lose some of its weight. It would always be part of me but no longer decide my future. Walking into the sunlight, I realized life's beauty isn't in perfection but in the courage to forgive, to love, and to keep moving forward despite uncertainty. My story doesn't end here but continues with hope. Hope that anyone feeling lost or rejected can find their way back, to themselves, to love, to belonging. In the end, we are more than our past. We are the stories we choose to tell, and the courage to tell them transforms not only those who listen but also ourselves.